I have had the pleasure and privilege to know Philip Zimbardo since 1971, when he asked me to be a consultant to his Stanford experiment, which has played a significant role in his road to fame. He is one of the select individuals who has not become corrupted by success and fame, as so many other ones, but has remained an unassuming and modest, highly respected, affectionately cherished role model to students and colleagues alike. He earned his reputation not only for his teaching excellence, he's a distinguished master teacher, scholarship, enthusiasm for his discipline and his incredible energy, but perhaps even more importantly, as a humanist and someone who puts his money where his mouth is. That also is an exception to the rule, I'm sorry to say. He's an activist, innovator, and doer and mover. He has been a supporter and friend of our program. He's an executive member of the Holocaust Study Center. Having said that, let me inform you about some of his numerous accomplishments. Professor Zimbardo is a professor of psychology at Stanford University, as I've already mentioned, where he has taught since 1968 after previous appointments at NYU, Columbia, and Yale University. He received his Ph.D. and also master's degree from Yale, the Ph.D. in 1959. His publications are longer than a hung salami, no ethnic slur intended. He's the author of more than 100 professional articles and books. Among his publications are his best-selling trade books, Shyness and the Shy Child, as well as the popular textbook, Psychology and Life, now in its 13th edition, making it the oldest continuously selling text in all of psychology. He has authored The Psychology of Attitude Change and Social Influence and the Cognitive Control of Motivation. Philip Zimbardo has won awards for his teaching from the American Psychological Association and recently received Stanford's highest teaching award for distinguished teaching. He is the designer, writer, and host of the award-winning PBS TV series Discovering Psychology, a 26-episode program covering major fields of introductory psychology. We, of course, have it at this university. His research interests have been broad and varied, as evidenced by multiple publications in Science, Psychology Today, the New York Times Magazine, and a range of professional psychological journals. Among the topics he has studied are test anxiety among school children, shyness in children and adults, the psychology of affection, dissonance theory, hypnosis, de-individuation, vandalism, aggression, teaching methods, time perspective, emotional arousal, and madness. That's a good one, isn't it? He is probably best known for his Stanford prison experiment in which college students played the role of prisoners and guards in a mock prison that became so real and powerful that the two-week study had to be terminated after 6 days. Philip Zimbardo's concern for giving psychology away takes the form of organizing teaching workshops for high schools and college teachers, community service, writing for newspapers and magazines and TV, and making appearances on national talk shows to promote psychology, such as the Donahue Show, the Today Show, Good Morning America, 2020, and others. He served as member of the board of directors of the Holocaust Study Center. His talk today tries to answer the question how people like young Germans in the 1930s and 40s could be so readily recruited by the SS to harm and kill other people during the reign of the terror we know as the Holocaust. Instead of an historical analysis, he will focus on social psychological research that offer some provocative analogies for us to reflect upon. He will deliver a lecture on violence this Friday in Washington, D.C. to members of various congressional subcommittees. This past summer, he began research on how torturers are trained for their job by governments. And he will give you some taste of it, a sample which relates to violence in Brazil. Welcome, Phil. We are very glad to have you here.
It is a delight to be back again. I was here, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago and had a wonderful time, both during the talk and especially afterwards with questions and meeting friends and colleagues for dinner. Before I begin, I want to thank you for coming. This is an incredible crowd on an afternoon occasion. I think it's a testimony to the fine work that the Holocaust Studies Center is doing and the guiding spirit that John Steiner and Carol Hurwitz have given it. It's one of the rare centers that does this kind of work on virtually no budget and little support. So it can use all the support you can give it in all the ways that that is possible. What I'd like to do today is essentially a slideshow. I use audiovisual material in part to convey the emotional or affective message that I want to get across. My words are going to get the intellectual cognitive message, but what we're talking about is not simply an intellect, something that if you don't respond to it at some emotional affective level, then you're not getting the whole impact of this experience. By the experience I mean whatever it means. By this experience, I mean it's the psychology of evil and some of the underpinnings that made the Holocaust possible and that can make another one possible in the future. The perspective I want to take is essentially shown in this slide. The argument I'm going to make is that we each have the potential for good or evil. I don't believe people are born good or evil. That anything any human being has ever done, we have that potential. That is, we have an infinite template to do good or evil. And in fact, once someone does something that was unthinkable, it now becomes thinkable and becomes part of every human being who has experienced that. The question is, why is it then that some people do evil? Why is it that some people become rescuers and other people become murderers? Why is it some people become torturers and other people become altruists? These are the kinds of questions we want to focus on. The perspective I'm going to take as a social psychologist says that we can begin by looking at individual characteristics, individual traits, but that approach has not ever taken us very far. That is, to try to discover who are the good people, who are the bad people. What I'm going to take is a social psychological perspective which begins with the notion that maybe the differentiation between what's good and evil has to do more with characteristics of the situation you find yourself in and a certain proneness to respond in certain ways in that situation. So essentially what I'm going to talk about is how good people are recruited to engage in evil deeds, typically for good motives, from what we could call a situationist perspective. Essentially, the question of who is evil is a question that human society has been concerned with throughout all time. As you see on the screen, this is the cover of a book called The Malleus Maleficarum. It was the handbook of the Inquisition. It essentially started the destruction of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women throughout Europe, and a few in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. And it began the question that Roman Catholic theologians raised, a very interesting problem. How could there be evil in a world created by an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God? So that the question, and so the answer they gave, ultimately, through this long, torturous, scholastic analysis, was that, of course, it was the devil, and that God created the devil to test humankind. And the devil works on people not directly, but he uses intermediaries. He uses witches. And so, essentially, evil is part of the human condition because God puts Satan there essentially as a test, as a challenge for our free will. Given a choice of good or evil, what will you choose? If you choose good, you go to heaven. If you choose to be bad or evil, you go to hell. Well, the devil is not passive in all of this. He recruits witches. He recruits people that he works on, he influences, and they, in turn, influence the rest of us. So when you ask the question, who is evil, in the Inquisition, they could, well, these are various representations of Lucifer, Satan, the devil. These are various demons. And then, of course, the whole function of the Inquisition was to do a diagnostic analysis, to say, who among you are witches? Well, first we get spies to turn in one another, or we look for any kind of deviant behavior, so anybody who might have been, had any mental disorder in those days, probably people who stuttered. Anything which was not normal became a sign of behavior out of the ordinary and marked you as a potential witch. And then you know what happened. You were tortured, and if you confessed, you were burned alive. If you didn't confess, then obviously you were lying, and they increased the torture until eventually you did confess, or you refused to confess and you became a saint. But the basic question then has always persisted. That is, in societies throughout the world that take an individualistic perspective, we ask the who question. That is, we try to reduce complex problems to a simple answer to locate good and evil, success and failure in people. So here's a recent book, The Evil That Two Men Did. These are the most evil people in modern times. Hitler, and the more we learn about Stalin, it turns out he may have been even worse than Hitler in terms of sheer number of people killed under his orders, especially sheer number of Russians, Soviets, who were killed under his orders. The problem with this individualistic approach, this personality-oriented approach, the search for traits that underlie good and evil, is that it's very hard to identify people before they commit the deed. After the fact, you can say, oh, sure, Hitler's evil, Stalin is evil, Lieutenant Calley is evil, the man who captured and kidnapped and raped little Polly Klaas, obvious. But interestingly, as you see in this picture, lots of people who do evil deeds, who harbor evil thoughts, look just like us. In fact, I did a study about 10 years ago of 20 young men in California who had recently committed homicide. They were all in California prisons. We went to interview them. And they were divided into two groups. Half the men had a whole history of crime. This was their first murder, but they had engaged in burglary and armed robbery. They were violent men who also... The other 10 were men for whom this was the first time they ever broke the law. That is, they had no history of crime, no history of violence. They were what we're going to call sudden murderers. How did they differ? Well, we interviewed them, we gave them various tests. The men who were the habitual criminals, their problem was they had no impulse control. That is, whenever they felt angry, they expressed it. Whenever they were frustrated, they attacked the object of their frustration. Their self-image was masculine, assertive, aggressive, kind of a John Wayne type. And, as you might expect, these men were very outgoing, extroverted. The men who were the sudden murderers were exactly the opposite. Their problem was they never expressed impulses. They had excessive control over their impulses. One, their self-image was not masculine. It was either feminine or androgynous. That is, they thought of themselves as nurturing, as non-assertive, and as you might expect, the reason we did the research is most of them were shy. 80% of them characterized themselves as shy men. And so how do they get to be killers? Well, these are the good little boys. In fact, these are the Boy Scouts. These are the ones who never said no to their mother. These are the ones who never objected when they didn't get what they want in life. Well, but as you can see in the picture, inside there was a rage, although outside they were unwillingly obedient little kids. And it turns out in every one of the 10 cases where they murdered somebody, it was almost always over a trivial incident, literally the straw that broke the camel's back. It might be as simple as somebody's in a bar, and the shy man puts money on the jukebox, and somebody else comes not knowing that and presses a button, and their song goes on rather than his. Well, it's a very trivial thing, but if for 30 years you have been getting stepped on, you have been made to feel, yeah, that little incident in that instant was enough to do it. Or the young man who finally, after years, had his first girlfriend, and then turned out it was not the right one for him, and he told her that he didn't think the relationship was a good one. She began to cry, and he said, fine, fine, fine. That night when she went to sleep, he suffocated her. And he said to me, he said, it's easier to kill her than to talk. I didn't know how to negotiate. I didn't know how to handle the conflict. And so, in fact, the point here is simply that the same event, two sets of committing homicide, engaging in violence, were from totally different motives, from totally different orientations, and we would have no way of predicting in advance that these shy men would have engaged in that behavior. It's not typical of all shy men, but in fact, most of the serial killers, most of the men, because violence is essentially now a male public health menace, those crimes are almost always by people described as loners, essentially as shy people. People who, in a sense, somehow are isolates, that they have not been integrated into the society. Well, this individualistic notion is a central part of psychology, of psychiatry, Freudian psychoanalytic theory. It's also part of religion. It's part of our economic way. In an individualistic society, success and failure are always located in people, in personality traits. So after the Second World War, personality psychologists, actually at the University of California in Berkeley, trying to understand the nature of the Holocaust, said, hey, it all has to do with the authoritarian personality. There are a set of traits that typify a certain orientation toward life, of dominance over people beneath you, submission to people above you in status, concern for power, and that the German national character was filled with these kinds of people, and so you put them all together in a critical mass, and so you have a personality interpretation of the Holocaust. Well, it doesn't go very far, that interpretation, because when you're now talking about the Holocaust, you're talking not about Hitler issuing an order or Himmler or Goering. You're talking about tens of thousands of people over many, many years who were involved in every level of that destruction. You're talking about the people who built the camps, who built the gas chambers. They're talking about the accountants. You're talking about the architects. At every level, when you begin to go beneath the level of people who give the orders to the people who carry them out, don't need authoritarian personalities for people to be functionaries to simply do their job. And so one of the points that it's an obvious one that's often overlooked when you take this personality approach is that when you're talking about the Holocaust, you're talking about a political, social structure that was created, that once it was created, it was independent of Hitler or any of the top people. That is, someone running a concentration camp did not ever have to be in contact with the authorities, the leaders of the Nazi Party in Germany. It was a business. In the same way somebody running a prison in New Mexico or Susanville, California, are not in daily contact with the Department of Corrections. It's simply a structure that, once it has its rules and its everyday agenda, simply carries on by itself. Now, I don't mean, I'm going to now present social psychological research, which includes normal, essentially like most of the students here, put in experiments in order to demonstrate the power of a variety of situational variables. We're going to make an analogy, not with the horror of the Holocaust, but what I really want to do, because that would be sacrilegious virtually, but what I really want to do is to say, let's look at some of the processes by which a normal, good, ordinary young person, like the people in this audience or my students, subtly recruited to do something that they say they would never do. Let's begin by having them harm another person. Let's have them begin by harming another person who is a nice person, who's a good person, who doesn't deserve to be harmed, who has done nothing wrong to them. Well, that's exactly the situations between the Nazi guards and the Jews and all the other people who were inmates. They hadn't done anything to them personally. There was no personal revenge, no personal vendetta. It's not even like the shy, sudden murderers for whom this person did something to them. Fit a category that they were Jew or Gypsy or Catholic or socialist or communist. And if you fit that category, then the rule said they had to be dealt with in a certain way. And the question is, how do we begin, at the very beginning of this situation, how do we begin to recruit enough people, enough young people, mostly men, but in some cases women were involved in various ways, to do those jobs, to line them up, to all of the parts short of turning on the gas, taking away the wedding, taking the gold out of their teeth, cutting off their hair. All of those dehumanizing, demeaning tasks were done by good people to other good people. And so the research I'm going to present begins to look at that. It creates contrived situations, things that are very far from what happened in everyday life in some experiment. And from each one, we try to draw a principle. And then we try to get each experiment, the next experiment, a little closer to real-life situations. And then from each of these, we try to say, what is the underlying psychological, sociological, political principle operating? And that becomes a hypothesis to test in the next study. And ultimately, if I can speed up in time, it's going to get us to real-life situations. We're going to ask questions like, how is it possible for someone to become a torturer whose job is every day to inflict enough pain on some other human being that that person will give information which will ultimately cost his or her life or cost the lives of people they may be trying to protect. And so that's what I'd like to try to do today. The study that many of you know, and I'll go through quickly, and I'll try to present some aspects of it that you might not know. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted a famous experiment called blind obedience to authority. What you may not know is Stanley Milgram and I were high school classmates at James Monroe High School in the Bronx. We sat next to each in class 12H3. And the interesting part, the side part of this is that both of our research, which I'll describe his and then I'll talk about mine, these are experiments which have become part of the foundation for saying situations matter. They matter more than we think. They matter more than we recognize. That even in individualistic societies, the best of us can be corrupted. The best of us can be subtly induced to engage in behavior that we would, when we're not in the situation, that we would never do. And lo and behold, there we are doing it. How? How is that possible? What's interesting is that the fact that we both come from the same poor neighborhood in the South Bronx and end up doing this research, I think one of the answers is poor people are always situationists. Rich people are always individualists. Because if you're rich, you want to take credit for for your success. If you're poor, you want to be able to externalize and say, look, it's the situation. So I think that's one of the reasons why we spent part of our life straight that situations are responsible not only for the poor, but also for why some people are rich. So in this study, as you remember very quickly, he began doing it at Yale University. He found remarkable results. And then he wanted to go beyond Yale to show that this is not true of college sophomores, this is true of people. So he set up a storefront in Bridgeport, Connecticut, advertised in the city newspaper, asking for people who were interested in studies of memory, psychologists interested in memory and how we can improve memory. Paid them, I guess, in those days, that was a long time ago, maybe $5 an hour. And what some people don't realize is he ran more than 1,000 subjects in 20 different experiments. So the Milgram experiment is not one study, it's 20 studies, where in each one he tried to vary some element, which I'll describe in a moment. But the basic design was simple. Two people would come at one time, and he began with what I'm going to call, what psychologists call the cover story, but we're going to think of it also as the ideology, a set of principles and beliefs which gives the whole thing meaning and sense and coherence. So when you come, he says, psychologists understand that reward improves learning. That's all the work of B.F. Skinner. But nobody has done research on the effects of punishment on learning and memory. Are there some people, are there some conditions under which punishing a wrong response immediately can improve learning? And if so, then we want to combine that with principles of reward to help people learn better. Are you interested in helping people learn better? Hey, who's not? Yes, of course. For $5, I'll be happy to do it. So the second thing is, so we're interested in helping people, one. We're interested in research that may be able to find the technique to help people. So this is a kind of cover story in the ideology. One of you is going to be a teacher. One of you is going to be a learner. So now he's going to assign high-status roles. Everybody wants to be a teacher. Everybody likes to be a learner. And he says it's random. You draw a straw. Big straw is the teacher. The small straw is the learner. So this person is going to be the teacher. He's going to teach the person in the next room who's a learner. And this is actually what this man looked like, a middle-aged Irish-American, very jovial, kind of stereotypically middle-aged, jovial, friendly Irish guy talking to each other. So the experimenter and the student and the teacher help put him in his kind of quasi-electric chair, put the electrodes, and then they go into the next room. Rules are simple. The teacher gives the learner a set of words to learn, to memorize, and then you go through one of these at a time, you call out one word, and the learner has to try to remember to give you the other word. If he gets it right, you say correct. If he makes an error, you press a button. What is the button you press? Well, there's a box with 30 switches. Each switch increases the shock by 15 volts. So it starts at a low level, 15 volts, and goes up to 30 and so on. And as soon as he gets it all right, the experiment's over, and then we look at the pattern of errors. Makes absolute sense, right? So you agree to do this, okay? I should mention failure to answer. If he doesn't answer in time, failure to answer is an error that must be shocked. Makes sense? Makes sense, okay? Everybody understands the rules, and there's now a verbal contract. Okay, once we begin, we're going to go through till he gets them all right. Okay, fine. Okay. So we begin now, and the amazing thing is the guy's doing well at first, and then he begins to make errors, and more errors. He's getting shocked more and more and more, and he gets to the point where he begins to yell, hey, wait, this is really hurting. Now it's 80, it's 100, it's 120, it's 130. And they get up to 200 or 300 volts, and this guy is now screaming. He's saying, God, I can't stand it anymore. Look, I got a heart condition. I didn't know it was going to be this bad. I want to quit the experiment, forget about it. The assistant, the person who is the teacher, turns to the experiment and says, hey, you heard that. Who'll be responsible if something bad happens? The experiment says, I'll be responsible. Please continue, teacher. Again, it's a status. He goes on some more, and the guy keeps screaming louder and louder. And in almost every case, the person who was the teacher, who's a good person, dissented, said, I can't go on. This doesn't make sense. I can't hurt this man. The experiment says you must go on. The contract calls for you to complete the experiment. You agreed. I'll be responsible. And so the question is, who would go all the way? All the way, as you can see, is 450 volts. When you get up to 300, it says high voltage, and then when it gets up to here, it says double X danger. Well, before Milgram began the study, he asked 40 psychiatrists what percent of the American public would go all the way to 450 volts, describing the study as I've described it to you. Their answer was fewer than 1%, only the sadists. Okay? Now, their interpretation from their whole training is individual psychopathology. This is really a pathological thing to inflict this much pain on somebody for any reason. So they said a person who would do this has to be pathological himself to engage in pathological behavior. Less than 1%. It's important to keep that notion in mind. And these are 40 psychiatrists who supposedly know more about human behavior than the average person, certainly much more. That's how they make their living. Here's the results of his first study. What you see over here is the number of subjects who stopped giving the shock, and this is the number of volts at which they stopped. Nobody stopped before 290 volts. Okay, so the first person who quit, who said, I refuse. Now the interesting thing is, I said everybody dissented. The issue is, did you disobey? Did you say, I refuse. I won't shock him anymore. Okay? So nobody stopped before 285. And the red lines are how many people stopped at each level. So some stopped at 315, 345, 375. The result that everybody always presents is that 2/3 of the subjects, about 67%, went all the way, gave the 450 volts. Now, I should mention that when it gets to 300, it gets about 350, the person screams, there's a thud, and from 3:50 on, there's silence. Okay. I mean, he could be dead. And so, he's not responding. Experiment says failure to respond is an error. You remember that. You must continue. So now you continue to shock him, even though he's not responding. Okay? Parenthesis. You are supposedly there to help the person become a better learner. Okay? How could it be shocking somebody who's unconscious is helping to improve his memory? It doesn't make sense, but at that point, you have now stopped processing information in a rational way. You are now trapped in this situation, and the important issue is how to get out. Because all the ways you usually get out, say, who's going to be responsible? And people around you say, not me, not me. Once this guy says, I will be, well, that way is cut off. Now, if you quit the experiment, there's a hassle. The experiment is not letting you quit easily. You have to use the right words. You have to say, I quit the experiment. You can't just say, look, I'm upset. The experiment says you must go on. It doesn't matter if you're upset. So people don't know how to exit. Also, there's something called exit costs. Once you get up to 350 volts, you've been shocking this person mercilessly. He's been, and at this point, if you're thinking of quitting, why didn't you quit earlier? You've already inflicted all this pain. And my analysis is once you get up to the 315 volts or so, it's easy to go quickly all the way to the end, and then you end the experiment, you fulfill your obligation, and you're out. Okay? If you stop now, you've wasted, you have all of these sunk costs that you put in. It's like Vietnam. So that you're going to keep bombing rather than say, we made a mistake, the contract doesn't work, I quit the experiment, I get out. And so you continue on. Okay? The thing is that this result was replicated many, many times. I won't go through the details. These are 19 of the different studies he did. And the blue line is the percentage of obedience. If you average across these, it comes out to 2/3. But in some studies, he got over 90% of the people, 9 out of 10, complying. You could wipe out the effect by having the teacher come in the experiment early and see some other teacher go on. So if you model disobedience, people will become disobedient. If you give them conflicting results, people will refuse. The point of this study, of this graph, is to say, blind obedience to authority in this setting has very little to do with the personality characteristics of the people involved. You can manipulate it, you can increase it, not by putting people who are sadistic versus people who are altruistic. You can take anybody and put them in, and if they're in experiment number 17, 18, 5, 8, or they're going to show high levels of obedience. If they're in these other experiments, they're not going to be obedient at all. So that it's by manipulating some feature of the situation, the roles people are playing, the relationship to the authority. If you have high school students, you bring them to Princeton University, so the authority has a lot of power. 80% of the people comply. These results hold equally for men and women, for old people and young people, for educated and non-educated people. The conclusion of this study is that trying to understand the Holocaust in terms of something like Aryan personality doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because, one, too many people were involved in Germany. Certainly not everybody is authoritarian just because you happen to be German living in that period in the 30s or 40s. And secondly, what you got there was a system of obedience to authority of all of these different levels. And this study says you can get ordinary people, ordinary Americans in 1960, 1970, who don't have authoritarian personality types, who are not the German national type, and you can get them to obey an order, in this case, virtually to execute a stranger. The other few things that are important here is he began the study by having people give 15 volts, not by having them give 450. Okay? That's an important principle. That is, if you want to get somebody to do something they wouldn't do, get them to do just a little bit of it. Don't ask for the whole thing. Get them to take the first step. Get them to sign something. Get them to make a minimal commitment, and then build on that by having each step be fairly noticeably different from the previous step. And then you get to a point where now the person has invested time and effort and emotion, and there's a point at which it's easy to continue to do this rather than to say, I made a mistake. Let me switch for a moment. Suppose I was here from the CIA, and I have a proposal to the young people in the audience. We've just discovered a spy. We're discovering spies everywhere, apparently, in Washington. And if you're a spy, that means you're a traitor, and if you're a court of law, Your peers judge you to be, you have to be executed. You're going to be executed by a firing squad. I want to know who's going to pull the gun, okay? Who's going to pull the trigger? So here's this guy, and he's justifiably accused. He's committed. He has to be killed, and he has to be killed by a firing squad. So I need 8 good people to do this for their country. How many people would be willing to do that? 1 person. Okay, I need 7 more. Okay, 2 people. Okay. How are we going to do that? Well, suppose I said, look, you know, your gun has 6 bullets, but in fact, and there are 8 of you, that's 48 bullets, but only 1 of them is a real bullet. All the rest are blanks. So now let's diffuse the responsibility. So you only have a 1 in 48 chance that when you pull the trigger, you know, you're shooting a bullet. And you'll never know. All we know is somebody pulls the trigger and this guy dies, and we've all satisfied our obligation. Well, this is in fact what we do, what nations do. They know people don't like to kill other people gratuitously, even for good reasons. So we build in, as Milgram did in his experiment, where the experiment said, I'll be responsible. Here we build in diffusion of responsibility. So this is another technique by which you can get good people to do evil deeds, by diffusing the responsibility. So no one says, hey, it's on my shoulders. Well, it's all of us. It's shared. Well, in fact, nobody can identify who really is the responsible one. Again, in all of these situations where people behave irresponsibly, we're always tempted to say, well, yeah, but maybe if we knew more about the person, we could understand that there was something evil about them. Indeed, I had a running argument with a famous, I guess, psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm, that John Steiner helped me to moderate, where he argued that, in the research I'm going to describe later, that people must have had latent sadistic impulses sadistically. That he couldn't believe that people could be, good people who were not sadistic could behave sadistically. That is, if you have that mentality, you have to believe that there are internal personality and dispositional traits that guide behavior. Well, 2 psychologists at Princeton University did the following study. They're going to take the goodest, bestest people there are, and they're going to have them engage in a different kind of evil. One of the evils of the Holocaust that Elie Wiesel points at is the evil of inaction. Some people did terrible things to other people. Some people look the other way. It may not be as bad, but looking the other way allows the system to go on. And certainly people who are engaging in evil take as support any form of anything which is non-critical, they can interpret as support. So the silent majority or the silent minority is seen as support. So this study is going to be a study of the Good Samaritan effect. You know what that is? There's a man who was beaten up and robbed and left by the roadside on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, and people pass him by. He's lying in the road, and people just pass him by, indifferent to his needs. And finally, a Good Samaritan stops, picks him up, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, gives the innkeeper some money, comes back the next day to see how he is. And this becomes an important aspect of biblical morality. That is, the idea is everyone to help the least among us. The good people, the Pharisees, the rich people passed him by, and they'll get theirs in the end. Well, at the Union Theological Seminary in Princeton, here are these young men who are being trained to be priests, reverends, and psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson had them as the subjects. So the subjects in this experiment, we're going to reproduce the Good Samaritan effect in a laboratory setting, in a sense. So one at a time, these people come and they're told, we're interested in the power of the sermon. We want to videotape you giving a sermon as powerfully as you can, and the sermon is going to be the Good Samaritan. Do you know what that is? Of course, they all knew it, and they had them repeat it, so they knew what this was. And we're going to have you video it in our communication department down the street, and then we're going to show it to people and see the extent to which your sermon can influence people. And then we're going to analyze what is it about each sermon presenter that's important. Well, that's the cover story. That's not the real story. Well, what happens is the experiment is giving the spiel, and then finally he says, oh my God, you're late. I really talked too long. You're really very late. Go down the stairs, go through the alley, go in the communication department, go up in this room and so forth. He tells that to 20 people. One, of course, the next group of people, he says, same story, he says, well, you're a little bit late. Go down, don't dilly-dally, get on the way. And the other people, he says, well, if you leave now, you'll be right on time. So he has three groups of people. The only thing he has varied is their sense of the extent to which they are late to complete this obligation to this authority. What's on the way between the psychology department and the communication department is a poor guy lying covered in blood, moaning on the street. And what is the psychologists call the deepen that they're going to measure? Well, how many of these good theologians who are on the way to give the Good Samaritan talk act as Good Samaritans? If they are very late, 90% pass him by. 10% stop. As they have more time, you get 45% stop. If they're early, then 63% stop. Even these are not very high numbers, that a lot of them pass them by. And of course, once they get there, they have them give the Good Samaritan talk, and then the experiment. Gee, did you notice anything on your way over? Was everything fine? Did you get here? And some people say, yeah, there was a guy, I think he was drunk. Other people didn't even see him. I mean, they stepped over him, and they didn't realize it. Well, the point here very simply is these are not, in quote, callous people. One of our interpretations when we see bystanders not intervening, we make the personality interpretation. We say they must be callous. There's something about them. They don't have sympathy for people. Well, it's unlikely that these particular kind of people were callous or non-sympathetic. What's important is they were under time pressure. They had an obligation to fulfill, and that structured their vision of this task. And so anything that interfered with that, a person who needed to be helped, interfered with the primary objective, namely giving a talk about a person who helped somebody else. Under questioning, then, finally, people did say, well, now that you mention, he could, I thought I was going to go back after I did this. Well, you don't know after the fact how much is a justification, but what you do is that manipulating a simple aspect of the situation, namely a person's sense of perceived time pressures when you have to fulfill an obligation, is enough to have a powerful impact on behavior, getting people not to intervene when intervention could have been called for. Suppose the person had an epileptic fit. Suppose the person even was drunk and had fallen over, was unconscious. Sometimes a half an hour could make the difference between life and death, and these theological students passed them by. Well, the Milgram study and this study have important implications, but again, what's interesting is they really are how an individual relates to another person. And the point I tried to make at the beginning, the Holocaust is really not about Hitler, except as a charismatic leader, and we'll talk later about ideology, which gets the whole thing going. And it really is my sense that once a leader like that gets the thing going, the leader becomes really irrelevant, because he could be better replaced by an image, by a metaphor. In fact, these people never saw Hitler. Okay? In the same way most Moonies never see Reverend Moon. That once you get a movement going, that you have an ideology, a belief system, the charisma of the leader is necessary to mobilize the energy to get it started. But what you have is a system, an institution, okay, which you don't have in the Milgram study. The Milgram study is a person and an authority. What I want to now do is to talk about research which is going to lead us in the direction of saying, so don't have a leader there. Suppose you don't have authority that says you must shock somebody, you must do this. That lots of violence and evil are done when you're in a group, when you're in a setting without somebody telling you that you have to do something. Okay? Now, those of you who remember Lord of the Flies, the book, Nobel Prize-winning book, there's several movies made of it. In that book, it talks about a group of boys who are abandoned, who escape a nuclear holocaust, apparently somewhere in Europe. They're boys, British choir boys, again, like our theologians, good little kids. And suddenly they're on this desert island, which is really an analogy to Eden. And the notion is, here is, in quote, mankind given a chance, another chance after Adam's mistake. So these are all little boys, choir boys on this island, no adults, and now they have a chance to recreate society. And the beginning of the book, democracy rules, right wins over might, and it's very boring, okay? Until you get 4. In fact, my students who read this, if they're chapter 3, they're ready to quit, say, what a stupid book, you know. You get to chapter 4, and then an interesting thing happens. Food runs out, And on this island, the only source of food are little piglets, or big pigs and piglets. And so the boys go to kill the pig, but they can't do it. That action of killing a living being is inhibited by all of their socialization. And so they can't kill the pig. And they're about to starve. One of the boys, named Jack Meridew, interesting name, of course, for the reason, suddenly takes his clothes off and paints himself. And several of the other boys follow suit. Changing his appearance, according to William Golding, was sufficient to change something about his orientation. And now, not only can they kill the pig, they do it with delight. They do it with relish. They kill the pig. They sing a song about killing the pig. And at that moment, killing the pig now releases other primal urges. They now become, the fascists take over, rules over right. They beat up the little kids. And in the end, they kill a boy named Piggy. And Piggy is the intellectual. So the other message is fascism, has to destroy the intellectuals or thinking people. Interesting story. Is there any psychological validity to the main theme that changing your appearance, making yourself anonymous, making it so that people cannot identify who you are, that is sufficient and somehow to disinhibit these kinds of impulses which society has inhibited, namely to kill and to do other negative things. My students and I at NYU, and one of them is here now, Peggy, from 1960s, we did the following simple experiment. We're going to have students from Psych 1 come to the experiment, put them in a group, and as a group, they're going to be given the task of shocking another person, and we're going to give a cover story and ideology why they should do that and why it's meaningful and reasonable. And half the women we're going to make anonymous, take away their identity, and the other half we're going to stress their identity, make them feel special. And we're going to see, is there a difference in how they treat the victim? Okay? Let's run through the process. Here's a student comes, we check off her name. She comes in, we give the cover story is, we're interested in nonverbal behavior, so we don't want people to see your facial expression or your bodily movement, so we put a big lab coat on and we put this hood on. We tell them a number, we take away their name. One at a time they come in, so they don't know the identity of the other people, and the other people don't know their identity. And they sit around in this little group, flowery Ku Klux Klan kids. And now they listen to two tape recordings. The first one is of a very sweet, nice girl. The other one is a really obnoxious girl. We say, you're going to meet these two women in a moment. And these women are in a second experiment related to ours. They're in a study of the effects of stress on creativity. We want to see how does stress influence. Your job is to give them the stress by giving them electric shocks randomly throughout the procedure. And we don't want them to see your reactions, your facial reaction. We don't want to see, we want you to see how each other reacts. We put them in cubicles. We give them a sample of the shock, a powerful shock. The other girls in the comparison condition don't have the hoods. Instead of taking their names away and give them numbers, we have name tags on where we call them by their name. We treat them with respect. We emphasize the individual versus we de-individuate them in the other condition. Right in front of them, 6 feet away, behind the screen, they see me and the first of the two women. A green light goes on. When the green light goes on, it means shock is in the system, and as long as you hold your finger down, she's getting shocked. She's really not. Of course, in the Milgram study, nobody shocked. It's a Confederate. The nice Irish guy in the other room, the learner, is a Confederate. He never gets shocked. In fact, the whole experiment is tape recorded in order to keep it standardized. So he's not really yelling. It's a tape recorder. And same thing here. There's a little light. Whenever somebody presses a button, the light goes on. And she's an actress trained to yell and scream and turn and twist. And they have 20 chances to give a same level of shock. So in Milgram's study, the level of shock increased. Over here, it was standard high level of shock. And you have 20 chances to do it. This is women shocking another woman. Before we began, people said, oh, no, women are not going to do that. They're nurtured, and they're caring, they're kind, they're lovely, they're supportive, etc. Relationships matter. Not if you create the situation, right? And so we have women shocking another woman. And remember, once the study is started, all we say is, here's the conditions. There's no experiment in it. Nobody's saying you must go on. They're in the dark. They're in cubicles by themselves. And interestingly, suppose you didn't want to shock. Doesn't matter. As long as anyone shocked, She gets the stress, she jumps, and the experiment goes on. So you never have to confront the experimenter directly. The results very quickly are, this is how long they held their finger down. First half is the first 10 trials, second half is the second 10 trials. The main result is the women who were made to feel anonymous delivered twice as much electric shocks, both to the nice woman and to the woman who they thought was obnoxious. And in fact, they gave both of them slightly more as they went along from the first trial to the 10th trial. Women who were individuated gave much less shock, and they gave the nice woman less shock over time, and the obnoxious woman slightly more. But still, if you're anonymous, you give twice as much electric shock. We have repeated this study in a number of different ways, actually in several different countries, but we didn't have to go far. This is a famous picture from University of Wisconsin, 1971, after some of the anti-Vietnam strike. Here are police. This is before Rodney King. Count the number of cops beating up this one student. Well, in every case, before the police did this, they almost always put on masks, gas masks, the combat masks. They often took off their numbers or concealed. If they had names, they took off their name. This is the Rodney King thing. You can also do it at night. You don't need masks. As long as you're anonymous, we're going to argue it now makes it more possible to engage in behaviors that are normally alien or not typical for you. Well, what about Halloween? I mean, kids do this. I mean, people do this. We do it at Mardi Gras. We put on does that change your behavior? It all depends on the situation. Suppose we invited elementary school kids to a party, and at this party they could play games, and for each game they played they got points, and at the end of the party they could win incredible prizes, boats, cars, dolls, according to how many points they had. So the more points you win, the better chance you have to win these big prizes. Great, the kids come in, they want to play the games, and in fact for the first party they play, and the teacher says, who's working with us, says, the costumes haven't come yet, so why don't you begin and start playing the games. They play the games, and then in part two, she says, here's the costumes. Kids go to separate rooms, they put on the costumes, so the kids don't know who each other is, nor do the experimenters. They play the games for another 75 minutes, and the teacher says, sorry, the costumes have to go to another party. They take it off, and they play again. Okay? The kids are identifiable, part one, anonymous, part two, identifiable, part. What I've left out of the story is that there are two kinds of games. Some games are non-aggressive games, and some games are aggressive. What's a non-aggressive game? Teacher throws a beanbag in a tube. The child has to retrieve it in a certain time. If you get it in time, you get a point. What's an aggressive game? Teacher throws a beanbag in a tube. Two kids go in. The kid that comes out with the beanbag gets the points. And so there are a series of games. So to be aggressive didn't take more intelligence or anything. It just meant you had to, in some way, physically confront another kid. The results, and simply, are the three panels are A, the kids are identifiable. B, we put them in costumes. C, they're identifiable again. So these are the same kids. Okay. At the beginning, they win about 55 tokens, and about 40% of their behavior is aggressive. You now do one thing. You put them in a costume in a situation where they have the possibility and also the permission to be aggressive. And that's the important influence. Now what happens? Aggression goes up to over 80%, and this is one of the few times where aggression costs you. That usually there's an instrumental value. If you're aggressive, you get something. You steal somebody's purse, you beat them up, you take their money. Over here, it's costing you games and points, but it doesn't matter. And now they're playing this game for 75 minutes. Well, has this turned them into little beasts? Not at all. You change the situation by taking them out of the costumes, and what happens? They now, now 80% of the time they are getting tokens, and aggression drops down to about 30%. It's a very important study showing that simply changing some elements of the situation, making people anonymous and giving them the opportunity to be aggressive, will increase the aggressive behavior even when it costs you, and it doesn't have a lasting effect, a lingering effect. I'm reminded here of a very important finding that John Steiner told me, is that most thought about, well, what about the SS guards after the war was over? Imagine somebody who for 3 years was in that middle condition, that with the uniform on, with the permission of the authorities to do whatever he wanted to these inmates, who in fact beat up people or raped people or tortured people, put them in the gas chamber. The war is now over. Okay? What do you do the next day? Well, if you are a psychoanalytic orientation, well, you have all these sadistic impulses and you go around and you do these terrible things. Not at all. According to John, and he can verify, is the people who were most of the people in the SS were, in quote, ordinary men before the war, ordinary men after the war, that there was no carryover of latent sadistic impulses, that you could not distinguish them in terms of antisocial behavior patterns before or after this unique situational setting in which they were given permission by the government, by the authorities, to engage in this violent behavior. And they did it in the uniform. They did it in the costumes where as a group, and in this group setting, you were no longer Phil Zimbardo, you were officer so-and-so with a number, and were treated as simply a part of this category. Well, we know, again, putting people in Ku Klux Klan outfits, the reason we chose that kind of anonymity is we know that in our own society, this often led to violent behavior, that under the mask of anonymity, you could do things you would not be able to do ordinarily, like lynch people. An anthropologist at Harvard University, John Watson, read some of this early research I had done and said, wait a minute, we can go beyond girls shocking girls in a laboratory or kids playing Halloween games. It ought to be possible to go to the human area files that anthropologists collect in a number of universities and look for two bits of information. One, to what extent does a society prepare their warriors to go to war by changing their appearance? As you can see here. In other societies, you go to war without changing your appearance. No makeup, no mask, and so forth. And the second bit of information we can look for in the area files is how do they treat their victims? Who treats them humanely? Who kills, mutilates, and tortures them? And so he went, and what he did was he found, if you start with me at the lower right-hand corner, 23, N equal 23 is 23 different cultures, not people, cultures, whole cultures. And what he found was 15 of them changed their appearance before going to battle. 8 did not change their appearance. He further found that 13 of these societies of the 23 were high in killing, torturing, and mutilating their victims, and 10 did not do that. The important thing now is to look inside the matrix. And what you see is the amazing result. 12 of the 15 societies that changed their appearance killed, tortured, and mutilated their victims. Only one of the ones that were unchanged did the same. Looked at differently, of the 13 cultures that mutilated the victims, 12 of the 13 prepared the young men before going to battle by changing their appearance. So we know at a deep societal primitive level that before you ask young men to kill other young men, where that's a sanction in your society, you have to take away their identity so that they can kill under the guise of being somebody else. And so when they come back and give up the uniform, wash off the paint, give up the mask, they can go back to being good, young, loving men. Well, let me take it one step further. You can make people anonymous without masks, without the dark. You can make them feel anonymous by the way you treat them. Treat them with indifference, treat them in a dehumanizing way. Some students of mine at the University of Detroit, Kiernan and Kaplan, did the following study. It's called Who Rips Off the Professor? Students come into the experiment, and in one condition, professor says, look, you're late, whatever your name is, 3579 on this list, fill out this form, take it down to the secretary, get it done in time, I really can't stand students who are always, late and have excuses, don't even tell me, just do it. And he leaves. In the second condition, he says, look, you're late, Mr. Johnson, fill out the forms, take it to the secretary, we got to get this done in a hurry. In one, he uses the name, the other one he doesn't. One, he treats him with minimal respect, the other with no respect. He leaves, and the form is there, and in front of the student is a bowl of candy, a bowl full of small change, and a bowl full with pens and pencils. And the question is, after each subject leaves the room, you count up how many pennies, how many money, and other things are there. And it turns out that where they're anonymous, 10 of 14 students steal from the professor's desk. Okay? So where you treat somebody in an anonymous way, they pay you back. You show them no respect, they show you no respect back. Where they're identifiable, 11 of the 14 do not, are good law-abiding. You have 3 who do, but that's the individual differences. Okay, so what the situation has done is made at least 7 more people engage in theft who would not ordinarily. Okay. So I developed this model, which I won't go through in any detail, but essentially the whole notion is, how do we lower your inhibitions against behaving in ways that are alien to you? The reason, or why is it you don't steal, rob, cheat, rape, do the things that you might get away with if you're strong and powerful? Well, typically you don't because of what's called cognitive controls. You're a thinking person. You have a conscience. You're concerned about what other people think of you. So what we have to do is weaken or override the cognitive controls that constrain your direct action. Guilt, shame, responsibility, commitment, moral values, fear of consequences. Those are really the reasons why most people don't do things, antisocial things. But also, it's not social. If you're anonymous, you're not accountable for your behavior, so social evaluation drops out. Diffusion of responsibility, we talked about that before. If we can get you in a present-oriented mindset, so you don't think about the future and the consequence of your behavior, you're going to behave in these more impulsive ways. If we can put you on drugs, alcohol, sensory overload, alter your state of consciousness. And again, many soldiers in many countries before going to battle, they get drunk, they get high, get on drugs. Emotional arousal, physical arousal, get you in a group, acting out. These are all ways to get you to what? Stop thinking and start acting, to get you to be emotional rather than cognitive. And if we can do that, then there are lots of output we can predict. You're going to have impulsive, emotional, irrational, regressive, intense behaviors that once you start, they're hard to stop. They're going to be self-reinforcing. Once you start, you don't need somebody to say, keep doing it. It's going to get exciting to be destructive, to be impulsive, to be violent. You're going to imitate the behavior of other people. You're going to be unresponsive to reference groups. Your mother, God, the church, those are irrelevant in that situation. Your behavior is going to be plastic. Namely, it's going to be as easy for you to make love as make war, depending on the situation. So it's going to be Woodstock and love and caring, if you remember that, or Altamont in California with violence and the Hells Angels, so that what looks like the same situation to outsiders could be very different. And if you're in this state of de-individuation, you are now totally vulnerable, totally susceptible to powerful forces in the situation and not anything about your personality. Okay, let me go on. So what I've talked about very, very briefly is a set of studies, a small set among others, that show that situations can exert powerful influences, getting people to engage in violent behavior, antisocial behavior, cheating, aggressive forms of aggressive behavior. You can do it with mass, you can put people in the dark, you put them in groups, or you just treat them in this way. Well, let's add to this. Situations can be anonymous. You can be in a situation where without a hood, without a mask, you look around and you say, look, nobody cares about me. Nobody knows who I am. Nobody cares. I don't care about anybody else. That's what it means essentially to live in New York City, where I grew up. But a study was done in Philadelphia. This is housing projects for poor people. You're randomly assigned to the high-rise or the low-rise. If you're in the high-rise apartment, there's 4 times as much probability of crime, 4 times as much crime. You have 4 times as much chance of being victimized. Same background. The more anonymous the setting, the greater the possibility of antisocial behavior. Well, if you go to New York, as I did, I lived in New York for my first 25 years of my life, all over the city you see cars like this, vandalized cars. And you ask people, who are the vandals? Black kids, Puerto Rican kids. I mean, the riffraff, the little gangsters. Have you ever seen one? Nobody has ever seen a vandal. It's absolutely amazing. That is, I have never met a person who said, yeah, I saw one. What did he look like? Well, I don't know. He's kind of strange. He had these things coming out. So he said, so why don't we see what a vandal looks like? So we did this simple study. This is NYU in the Bronx. Across the street, I bought cars, put them in the street, took off the license plate, put the hood up, and we're going to film. We're going to put it out. So this is like bait. We're going to put out the bait and watch the predators. And we did the same thing near Stanford and Palo Alto, College Terrace. We put a car, put the hood up, took the license plate off, and we set up. By then we had a video camera, time-lapse photography. We're going to photograph this, see what happened. In New York, we didn't have to wait long. In 10 minutes, precisely 9.45 minutes, a car pulls up. 3 people get out. We think it's a mother, father, and son. The father gives some instructions. The mother empties the glove compartment. The kid empties the trunk. The father saws off the radiator, takes the battery, they get in their car, drive away. 10 minutes later, another set of people come up, they jack up the car, take off the 2 tires, they drive away. Here's a guy walking away with the back seat. The interesting thing is that in 2 days, in 48 hours, there were 23 identifiable, what we call destructive contacts with that car. All of them in the daytime. We thought it was going to be at night. And of the 23, how many were kids? 1. A group of kids came near the end, and they did, in fact, break the windows and so forth. But 22 of the 23 were adults. As you can see, in most cases, driving cars, in most cases, fairly well dressed. You know, you'd say at least lower middle. And in fact, after a while, we went down, and we were interviewing while they were doing that. And they said, okay, you can take the front seat, I'll take the back seat, you know, because there was a sense of anonymity in that environment where you didn't need a mask, you didn't need a hood, you didn't need the dark. And if this was out, then the sense is anything without a license plate means that it's available. In Palo Alto, what happened? As you can see, it rained. One of the rare days it rains in Palo Alto. Somebody passing by put the hood down. God forbid the motor should get wet. Okay? That was the only person in a week, we had to leave it out, who touched the car. We moved the car onto the campus at Stanford. 3 people called the police to say an abandoned car has been stolen. Okay? Now, obviously, we had arranged with the police in advance. What does this mean? Well, what this means is that's the difference between a sense of community and a sense of non-community. It's the difference between 1 murder last year in Palo Alto and 39 murders in East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto is like the Bronx where we did this study. So that a sense of community, one of the few ways to guard against crime and violence. And again, if we had time, I'd tell you all the reasons why 3 strikes and you're out is going to create more crime. Prediction. 5 years from now, crime and violence will be greater than it is now, in large part because of 3 strikes and you're out. Because we're not changing any of the root causes, any of the things that lead people to engage in violent criminal behavior. Dealing with the output will have no impact, in fact. It's going to make prisons the most violent place in the world. Anybody who goes to prison, crime, is going to come out violent. I mean, all the people who are 1 strike or 2 strikes are going to come out and prey on us the way they've never had. Well, again, here's Los Angeles, South Central, people destroying cars, people vandalizing windows, people burning down the city, and of course we call in our guards to protect us. A nightmare come true. Well, again, you have people who live in conditions of anonymity. You don't need our mask, you don't need a hood, you need to do is be poor, not to have a job, to be treated as outcasts for society. The conclusion is anything that makes you feel anonymous makes you my potential assassin. Any conditions in society and the culture that enable you to say, nobody knows who I am and nobody cares about me, at that point, there's no reason for you to have any moral code. For me, the amazing thing is that violence is not greater in and around the ghetto than it is. Last point here, before we take a 2-minute break to get into the ideological part of this is, what we've talked about is how you change yourself so you could become more violent. We put you in mass and so forth. What about the victim? Well, we can produce the Nazi effect by, we have to add that other element, is that we have to dehumanize, take the humanity out of the enemy. We have to get you to see them as not real people, as not similar to you. Okay? And how are we going to do this? A study was done by Al Bandura at Stanford. Very interesting study, not reported very much, some years ago, in which there are 3 groups of people. Stanford students are going to be the subjects, and they're in a small group. That another group of students from another school, I don't know if they said San Jose State or not, are coming, again, for some study where you have to deliver electric shock while they're trying to work on some task. You have to see can they persist on the task even with this distraction. So your shock is going to be distracted. It's not super painful, at least initially. Well, what happens is, in one condition, you overhear the assistant tell the experimenter, you're now one of the subjects, the subjects from the other school are here, we're ready to begin. That's the neutral condition. In the humanized condition, you hear, the subjects from the other school are here, we're ready to begin. They seem like nice guys. You as a subject don't know, you don't see anybody, you just hear this. The important thing is the third condition, you hear the assistant allegedly tell the experimenter, subjects from the other school are here, we're ready to begin. They really seem like animals to me. Animals, nice guys, nothing. Experiment begins. This is the level of shock, mean shock intensity, how big it is, over 10 trials. What you can see is where they all begin at the same low level. So nobody is jumping on, being violent. But after the very first trial, you see that the people who are told that these guys are animals now give more and more shock, and you get a linear increase that is over the 10 trials that's shocking more and more and more, where the middle level is where you don't know anything about them except your job is to give them shock. The other important part is where you humanize them, just say these guys are nice, that you give significantly less, and it's fair. So that simply dehumanizing somebody by putting a negative label on them is enough. Look at the negative label, could be anything. Could be a Jew, could be nigger, could be WAP. Any label that the people who have the power see as negative is sufficient to, in the right context, have that act as an agent of dehumanization. We put all this together, I'll go through very quickly, into the Stanford prison study. What happens when you de-individuate the people? We put guards in these silver reflecting sunglasses, put them in this. We take a basement, and we get the shop technician, just as they did in Germany, to build our prison. We create an anonymous place with no windows, with no clocks, with no time of day, a barren prison environment. We recruit the Palo Alto Police Department to go around and arrest the students who had volunteered for the experiment without their knowledge of the arrest. The police car brings them down to the station. They get fingerprinted and booked as ordinary criminals would. Who are those kids? These are kids from all over the United States who happened to be in the Bay Area the summer of 1971, who answered our ad in the Palo Alto Times. Students wanted for a study of prison life, 2 weeks, $15 a day. We took personality measures, and we only picked the most normal, the most healthy kids there were. These are physically healthy and normally healthy kids who had no history of crime, drug addiction, or any way. They came down to our study. They were driven down, blindfolded, frisked, deliced, stripped naked, put in uniforms just as in real prisons, humiliated, dehumanized, chain on their foot to remind them of their loss of freedom, put in these tiny cells, treated indifferently, woken up several times during the night for counts, made to do push-ups with people stepping on them. This is a sign of push-ups at Auschwitz as punishment, guards stepping on them, kicking them, and our guards began to do that as well. Cleaning out toilet bowls with their bare hands. This is solitary confinement in a closet. You can see they stripped this guy naked and just put a towel on, put him in solitary confinement. Now again, this is like the other studies I talked about. Once the study begins, I'm not there. I don't tell the guards what to do. If anything, my only job is, when they come off duty, to say, look, you've been too aggressive, too violent. We're only doing symbolic aggression. They saw me as the liberal that they had to get around to deal with these violent prisoners. This is the isolation at the San Francisco County Jail, the equivalent of what we had. Students wrote letters home if they had relatives. We had parents and girlfriends, boyfriends come for visiting hours. We had priests come. We had public defenders. Lots of people came to this situation. And what they thought was an interesting experiment. Even when they saw their son crying, their son saying, this is the worst experience of my life, 5 of the prisoners had to be released, 1 each day, for emotional breakdowns. We replaced them with other people. Not all the guards were sadistic. For example, here's one who removed himself. He was a good guard. But the good guards let the prison go on because the prisoners then would do things to keep the good guards' goodwill. So then the other guards simply used him to go get the food, to do the menial activities, but no guard ever intervened in the cruelest guards' orders, commands, etc. We ended the study because after 6 days, boys we chose, because they were normal and healthy and sane on every measure we know in psychology, were beginning to behave sick ways, were beginning to engage in homosexual, getting the prisoners to behave in kind of homosexual ways, doing things which we could never imagine. And after the study, they said they couldn't imagine that they could ever do that. And boys we chose because they were normal and healthy. If they were in the prisoner role, were having breakdowns. One set of results where we videotaped and then analyzed, to say at the beginning of the study, we randomly assigned them. These were the same kids who, by a flip of the coin, were prisoner and guard. Now what you saw is they were two different groups. If you were a guard, you gave commands. You insulted people. You de-individuated them. You behaved aggressively. You gave threats. Questions, both guards and prisoners asked questions. Guards used instruments on them. And all the other things, the main thing a prisoner did was offered resistance. So now you have totally different profiles of behavior depending on your uniform, the situational characteristics that support you being dominant and powerful or being in the passive role. The last thing I want to mention, and then I guess we have to stop, so I won't be able to talk about Brazil. Maybe I have to come back. Helge Manson, a student of mine, did a study which, again, nobody knows about, and it was replicated. And it's really a study called The Final Solution Revisited. He went into the University of Hawaii, a class of 572 students some years ago, and he's Danish, and he has little eyeglasses, and he talked about the problems of population explosion and why we have to control the excessive population in the world. And of course, he realized that people who are unfit multiply, like poor people are always having babies and so forth, and they are going to overrun the world and make it impossible for the rest of us. And so I am here to solicit the advice of intelligent college students. I'm going around to different universities, is what he said, to see what recommendations do you have to give to deal with this problem. Okay. So, is it just to eliminate those judged dangerous to general welfare? 91% of American students at the University of Hawaii said yes. It is just to eliminate those dangerous to the general welfare. Who makes that judgment? What does dangerous mean? What does general welfare mean? Well, suppose you were required by law to assist. Which would you prefer? 85% of college students, because the intellectuals would like to be involved in the decision-making. 8% said, I would be willing to do the killing. 1% said, I'd like to decide and kill. Only 6% gave no answer. That's what you have to do. You have to be in a condition that gives no answer or challenges the whole thing. You stand up and say, you're not allowed to ask these questions. You tear up the questionnaire. Once you give an answer, then you're part of the problem and not the solution. Which is, now these are not beasts. These are college students like you. They want the thing that's most efficient, painless drugs. That's what they want to do. To preserve anonymity, should several people press a button but only one button cause death? Yes, yeah, that's a good idea. Most people say that. Now, the study was repeated, and somebody said, should the final solution be applied to a member of your family if necessary? 20% of the students answered yes, that if need be, the final solution should be applied to a member of my family. That's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. Kids turned in their parents. People turned in their relatives. The final solution was applied to members of your family who were judged unfit by some authority. Unfit if they happened to be a Jew. Unfit if they happened to fit any category that somebody said was unacceptable. Not Nazi Germany, not the Nazi type. This is Hawaii, college students, University of Hawaii. I guess it's about 15 years ago. I think what I was going to do is talk a little bit about how ideologies developed to create enemy and how people get social. I mean, what we haven't talked about is how does education fit into this? You don't just, it's not that you're a young man in Germany and somebody puts you in a uniform. You're going to schools which train you to think about Jews and the enemy in certain ways so that when you finally meet one, you already have prepared responses of hate, of revenge, to dehumanize these people. But I think that I should stop and to go on? Okay, 10 minutes if you can stay. I'm really, we'll wait. Christine, it's already in? No. You want to put the other tray in? Okay, what I was going to say, so let me advance so I can go really fast. I just have to see what the first slide is. Okay, all of our concern about violence is concern about random violence of citizens against citizens, and we should be. The main violence in many countries is war, okay? Research has shown that crime goes up in the 10 years following a war. Crime among men in the United States increased 110% after the Vietnam War and 54% among women after the Vietnam War. That is, what wars do is they justify violence as a solution to problems. And this is a study by Dane Archer, University of California, Santa Cruz. He studied this around the world. This is true of every nation. It's true of men and women. It doesn't matter if you win the war or lose the war. It doesn't matter if your economy goes up or down. One consequence of war is to increase violence among people, combatants and non-combatants. The Vietnam War was just one of the worst. So what we're seeing, the violence we're seeing now, one of it was help created by the Vietnam War, was reinforced by the Persian Gulf War and any other kinds of activities that we engage in. Here are soldiers, proud to be soldiers. It's wonderful. You mass them together. Well, a local resident, Sam Keene, did a study of, well, how do you prepare young men to kill other young men? And his conclusion is, before a soldier fires his first bullet, before he kills his first enemy, that his most powerful weapon is a metaphor of the enemy that has been programmed into him by his nation. And what he did was go around the world collecting these propaganda photos from Nazi Germany, from the United States, from Britain, from Japan, from Russia. And he's organized them in a book that you have to read called The Faces of the Enemy. And you can see that these images are collected around certain themes. The enemy as rapist, desecrator of our women and children, as animal, totally, as vermin, as pigs, as snakes, as octopus. Again, the theme of seducing our women, the enemy of God, enemy as criminal committer of atrocities, enemy as barbarian, the enemy as the greedy one who's going to take everything, the enemy as death, and finally the enemy is just an abstraction, a number, an object, but who's different than. The interesting thing is once you program that image in, here's people who look indistinguishable. Only these people are the enemy, and they have the chains around their necks, and the people who are their jailers, who look just like them, it doesn't matter anymore because they fit the characteristic of the enemy. Here's a terrible picture. You can't see it too well. These are soldiers in, I think it's Cambodia, who have just cut off the heads of the enemy. Although it's gruesome, look at the face of the enemy and look at the guy carrying him. Those look to me like this. Very little difference. So you don't have to be a different skin color. You don't have to be a different sex. You just have to fit the category of enemy. Certainly if the enemy is political. I mean, if it's because they're communists or Democrat or socialists, they're going to look just like you. Well, the other part of so here's an important part of the ideology. Create an image of the enemy which dehumanizes them, makes them different from you, and justifies your treating them as not only different, but ultimately you're going to have to kill them. The other part of this is the role of education. Here is a little girl being socialized into the mentality of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, a mother is taking her to rallies. She's hearing these hate speeches against blacks. Be no different today in many countries where neo-fascists are now taking over and little kids are hearing their parents saying, yeah, it's right, Hitler was right, Holocaust never occurred, and if it did, we didn't do enough. Well, the question is, how do we take little obedient kids in school and turn them into good little obedient Nazis? 1939 or 1994? John Steiner recently shared with me a textbook that was used in Germany, and this was a textbook of geography, peoples of the world. So now what you're going to do is present prejudice and prejudicial racist values as objective fact. That's what education is about. So here I just want you to look at these very quickly. What's established here is what is the difference Jew-like. These are little kids, 4 years old, 5 years old. This is the first time they've even heard that. And obviously they're black hair, and the blonde hairs are the Aryans. And so in a series of pictures, you're going to create a mentality in the children about what Jews are like relative to Aryans. You notice the little kids, the Aryan is with no shoes out there. The farmer's begging, the Jew's not giving him anything. The dirty Jew. The landlord kicking out the little child and an old man. Theme carried now with Farrakhan Khan, with Jews are the landlords of the world and mistreating blacks and others. Here's a doctor, and a couple comes in on this day. They're fat and he's skinny. They come back in a month. They're skinny and he's fat. He's taking their money. Here's almost a picture right out of The Making of the Enemy. So here's a lascivious Jew trying to tempt this Aryan woman. Here's his son happy about it. Here's her daughter sad about what's going to happen. And finally, they rebel. Finally, they're going to kick the Jews out of the school. They're going to not allow them to go to this park, this vacation land. And finally, they're going to kick them out of Germany. Okay? It's just a book. It's just a book, right? And here's the contrast, okay? And ultimately, here is the Jew, the vermin in the film, both Triumph of the Will and, what's the other one? In a number of the propaganda films in Nazi Germany, the whole notion of the Jew as vermin, as kind of destroying the world. Well, then what happens is, your teacher teaches as facts. They give you a test, you pass a number, and if you buy the first set of scenarios, the last three, what you should do about it, makes absolute sense. If people were that mean and that horrible, then yes, you shouldn't have to keep them in your school, you should let them play in your playground, and you should kick them out of your country. And so the argument is this is part of the preparation, the psychological conditioning, which allowed those kids, when they got older, to participate in the rounding up of the Jews, putting them in concentration camps, and ultimately in killing them. So there's the socialization, education part added to this kind of ideological component. The last thing I want to leave you with is violence. We're concerned about violence in the United States. If you want to see violence, you have to go to Brazil. That's where I was in the summer. As John said, we're studying the process by which ordinary young men are trained by the government to become torturers. I'm working with people from Greece who studied this with the military junta, and in Brazil from 1964 to 1980, thousands of Brazilians were tortured by the members of the military junta. And the question is, how do you become a torturer? Well, our research, now we're interviewing, all of them were given amnesty. So that all of those people who were torturers, people in death squads, execution squads that we interviewed, are all still in the police and in the government because they were given general amnesty. Well, in interviewing them, we're trying to find out, what is it that got you to do this? And it turns out, again, it's like John said about the Nazi guard, there's no history of any psychopathology prior to their being picked out to be in one of these groups. And they do it, it's a job they do it on the very anonymity. Some cases they take pleasure in it, some cases they don't, but they just do it. And after the war's over, after they're out of the job, they go back to leading ordinary lives. That's the banality of evil. That's the scary part. I couldn't tell by looking at somebody whether he was a torturer or one of the guys was a mass executioner, executed people. They gave him a list. He went around shooting people in the head. He said he liked that better than torture because there was nothing personal in that. So that's just a job. You put a mask on, you shoot somebody in the head, you say, I'm sorry, and you go on. So here we are visiting a prison. And while I was there, this is the summer, in the newspapers every day, they have this little chart of number of violent deaths in the Rio area. So this day there were 29. It's right above the lotto numbers, all the numbers they put together. And during this time, 5 policemen were murdered, apparently by somebody in one of the ghettos, which they call favelas. And the newspapers exploit violence. I mean, the front page headlines in all the newspapers, not just headlines, pictures throughout. They stimulate violence that the next day, Holocausto, the next day, the police from that battalion went to this ghetto and massacred 21 people. And the newspapers carry the close-ups of this so that they'll get revenge on the police. All the bodies were laid out in a public square so everybody could see it. This is the heading of this is a picture, a color picture in the newspaper. And so the level of, so what is it, where do they come from? Here's favelas in Sao Paulo that we visited. Everywhere, on every hill in all the major cities in Brazil are these incredible ghettos. There's nothing like that we've ever seen in the United States. People come from rural areas where there's drought, have no money, huge families, no skills, and they get some pieces of wood and tar paper or corrugated metal, and they patch it up, and they start building, and it becomes a community. At first, there's no water or electricity. If you get more than a certain number of people, he puts in minimal electricity and some cold water, but no sewage or sanitation. And these are dirty, filthy. This is the playground for the kids. This is where this man, some of these look like big dog houses, often with no windows. He has a sign up. He's selling his bracho. This is a picture you can't see too well. There's no birth control, and unfortunately the Catholic Church encourages or doesn't discourage any kind of birth control. So typically they'd be in their 30s, would have 8, 10, 14 kids. Well, what do you do with 8, 10, 14 kids in an 8 by 10 room if you have a lot of luxury? This is a woman who's about 12 years old with her baby. You can see how tiny it is. This is the sewage system, all broken. While we were there, we heard kids yelling, and we ran up. I saw blood. Oh, too bad. The man is holding a rat. The rat is the size of his arm. Unfortunately, you can't. Can we dim the lights for 1 second? Go for the TV just to dim that light for 1 minute. What? He still can't see. In his hand, I'm sorry, from his hand down to his out, is a rat. I mean, this big. It must have been 1.5 feet. He said that was a small rat. Okay. Because it's a dumb one. It's a young rat. The ones that are smart only come out at night. And so the rats bite the kids. Well, what happens is if a kid gets to be, 12 or 13 years old, there's no room. There's no physical room in these ghettos for the kids. Also, if they eat food, then the babies don't get it. So either the kids decide to leave on their own, or they get forced out. Or if they're girls, they get sexually abused, often by their fathers, whose only thing in life is to get drunk and have sex. That's all they have, since they're all unemployed, and they are the anonymous there. So these are kids sleeping on the street in Rio or on the beach. And they are a menace. And as you can see here, this guy has a gun. And in Rio, in many countries, they're practicing now what's called social cleansing. We've heard about ethnic cleansing in former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia. This is social cleansing. In order to live, there's no welfare. These kids have to steal every day. If they don't steal, they die. Nobody gives them any money because there's thousands of these kids all over. They are literally like packs of animals, beasts of prey. Well, so they have to steal. Well, they steal off tourists, they steal off local people, they risks. Well, people don't go to shopping malls anymore. So people who run shopping malls or stores, they hire the police to get rid of the kids. Okay? How did they get rid of the kids? Well, the first time we were there, they beat them up, they slap them, they torture them. Second or third time, they might shoot them in the hands or feet as a warning to them and the other kids. After that, they simply kill them. For the last year and a half, on the average, 4 children a day have been murdered in Rio alone. There are graveyards with these crosses, like you see, unknown soldier, with numbers, not even names. These kids are not, and nobody cares. Okay? So these kids now are the street kids, the slums of the world. So I'm using Rio as an instance of what's happening throughout the world. So here's violence, in a sense, of the state against its children. So what message does this convey to the rest of the population, that children's lives are meaningless? I keep thinking every time I see, Mayor Jordan talk about a new program for dealing with the homeless in San Francisco. They simply move them from place to place. All we need to do is get some of these guys to come and just clean them out. Save a lot of money and just kill them all. We can start all over. And I expect that's what's going to be happening soon. It's no use killing kids, says Rosemary. There'll always be more. As long as you keep producing them and they have no food, there's just always going to be more. What I want to leave you with is a positive and very poignant, sad message. That essentially what we're talking about is now social conditions, national conditions, worldwide conditions of chaos. That when we talk about violence in the United States, we are only a microcosm of violence throughout the world. Brazil is just one instance of it. We now see it in Russia. The boundaries between nations are breaking down. There's unemployment, unprecedented unemployment throughout the world. And what you see now is this frustration, rage, and the breakdown of basic moral codes. And you see this mentality of, you have to steal to survive. You have to use might. It goes back to the study of the Jack Meridew, Lord of the Flies. Might wins over right. So now the rise of fascism is going to be coming back. In Italy, there's an election coming up in 2 weeks. It's going to be between the fascists and the communists. The Social Democrats are out because they were involved in the scandals. Well, who are these street kids? They're who are the vandals in New York? Well, you go to one of these shelters, and these are the saddest children you've ever seen. These are kids who have not been touched by another human being for years. And all you do is, they're really tough, and you reach out, and they crumble in your arms. Okay? And it was so sad. In one of the shelters, now these are shelters where kids can come in for a few hours a day to wash up, to have a meal. There's only enough for a handful of these kids because there's so many. Well, in one of the ceramic shops, kids can make their fantasy thing. And here are these ugly masks. And this one over here in the middle is a kind of beast with a snake coming out of its mouth and going into its ears and wrapped around. And essentially, this is the kid's view of what his life is like. These things are happening to him that he has no control over. But over in the far right, next to the mask with the two white eyes, is another child's fantasy. And that fantasy is a double bed. Okay. And I think with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your stimulating and informative, excellent lecture. It's just really something which we will not forget very soon. Those of you who still have a little bit of time want to stay, maybe Philip Zimbardo will answer some questions.
If you have to leave, don't be polite. Leave. Don't feel constrained by the situation. You have to go, go. If you can stay, stay. Yes, I'll try to repeat the question. Wait, so they say that they prefer people who don't take pleasure in doing the torture. Right. 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 Yeah. Let me just add one point there before you go on. You see, if somebody enjoys torturing, then they're not likely to be a good torturer. They're likely to apply too much torture, or maybe not the right torture. I mean, a lot of tortures are really sexual things, and so the chances are they might kill the person, in which case you don't get the confession, you don't get the information, and the problem you have to deal with. Suddenly somebody is killed. The other thing I should mention there with regard to torture is, we looked at in Greece and Brazil. Most countries in the world, including the United States, practice some torture. The only question is how clandestine it is. In every case of torture, there almost always has to be at least one doctor and one nurse that signs off that this person had an accident, that this person had to have some operation because of some problem they had. So again, this is part of the complicity of the system of evil. It's not simply the person who pulls the trigger. It's not simply the person who turns on the gas. Every doctor, every nurse who knows that somebody has been tortured and knows somebody has been abused in this way, who justifies it in this legal way by signing a document saying, oh no, it was this other thing, is as guilty, participates, and keeps that system going. I'm sorry, second point. Yeah, I should, that's really, let me just answer very briefly because I want to hear from you rather than talk more, is we really don't know, no, I mean, let me back up. I've emphasized a kind of situationist perspective, but I realize there are individual differences between people, and that behavior we see is always a combination of somebody's proneness or resistance to engage in behavior. Some people are more shy and less shy in virtually all situations. So I know there are individual differences, but when it comes to this kind of extreme behavior, this kind of violent behavior, we don't have ways of assessing in advance with any personality test, with any measures we have, to indicate which people would be in the 100 and which people would be in the 400. In part because you can never know how you would behave in a situation that you have never been in before. All of our personality tests, without exception, ask you to say, what is characteristic of you? Are you the kind of person who would do A, B, or C? Often, sometimes, always, never. Well, you know, you say, are you the kind of person who would knowingly execute a stranger? Everybody would say no, because nobody's done that. Well, but the question never says, suppose, you know, you felt that if you didn't do it, that you would lose your job, that you would be letting down the group, that et cetera, et cetera. So that when we take a situation's perspective, we're not denying that individual differences make a difference, but we just don't know how to measure in any way that I understand how people can understand what they would do, how they would behave in a situation that they have never been in before. And when we asked them, would you do this, just like when we asked Milgram asked the 40 psychiatrists, they said almost nobody would do that, because they couldn't imagine what that situation would be like until you're in it and feel the power of the situation. I'm sorry, you had a question? Yes. Yeah, that's exactly, that's question one I'm going to get in Congress and say, okay, yeah, I mean, anybody could come in and throw stones. It's a very good question that, I mean, the first issue is violence sells. Violence is big business, okay, in our country. Part of the distortion has been, starting with Reagan and perhaps before Nixon, the whole notion that there are career criminals. That's really this dispositional thing, that there are some people who were born to be criminals. And sure, there are some people really violent, but none of the serial criminals fit that thing. Most of them are going to be more like my shy guys. So we're not even going to be able to detect those kinds of people. When I say violence sells, what I mean is that violence sells newspapers in Brazil and here. It turns out there has not been an increase in crime between 1993 and 1994. The statistics are almost the same. There's been a 30% increase in reporting of crime in the newspapers in 1994 over 1993. The news have made it a media event, okay? And I could imagine the editor of the New York Times got robbed or mugged and sent out some reporters saying, hey, you know, let's find out if, what's causing this random violent crime. Well, so it sells newspapers, it sells videos, it sells movies, it sells video games. Video games now, which are played by lots and lots of young kids, are every day more violent. I mean, the #1 games are what? Total Carnage, there's another one, any of you? Mortal Kombat, where you is to rip out the head of the victim. And as you rip it out, the blood shoots all over the screen. There's even something called a blood code that you can vary how much blood comes out on the screen. People who run video stores, and there was a national public radio program on video games, said, quote, violence sells. This is the head of a North Hollywood store called Games Dude. And he said, violence sells, the bloodier the better. I was having dinner with a rich socialite in San Francisco a few weeks ago as part of the Exploratorium. I did some work for the Exploratorium. I had a little dinner. And we were talking about violence, and this woman turned to me and said, gee, you know, my son who's 6 years old said he loves violence. I said, what? She said, yeah, I was surprised. He said he loves violence. I said, well, what does that mean? She said, I don't know, he just said it. Well, I know what he means. He means he loves to be in control of the video game where he is the agent of violence. He wouldn't say that if he was a kid in Bosnia, that if he was a kid in Brazil or in South Central Los Angeles. And so a lot of these kids, what they're learning is violence is wonderful when you have the resources to control other people using it. So I'm saying, so violence sells the same way cigarettes sell. I mean, cigarettes kill, and we know it. And in California, we are way ahead of the rest of the nation. You go to other places. You go to the racetrack here. You go to gambling places. You go back east. You go to Europe. And in fact, we are now cigarettes in the third world. I mean, that is, for every cigarette we now don't sell in the United States, we are selling 2 of them throughout the third world. Okay? So we are exporting. In the same way, we are now, since Russia has gone broke, we are the #1 exporters of arms. So we have all these handbill, gun control laws here, which again are nonsense given there are 200 million guns out there. If nobody ever bought another gun, it's irrelevant. I mean, there's enough guns to wipe out every state. But we have these laws which say you can't have a clip with more than 13 bullets in it. Wonderful. I mean, so you can only kill 13 people before you reload. But the point is, we are the major disperser of arms throughout the world. It's a big source of income. So I begin by saying, do we try to change individuals? And if we now add the result I talked about earlier, that to the extent that your government participates in a war, that they justify to you the need for violence to preserve national security, preserve our dignity, to preserve our way of life, democracy, whatever the ideology, it's irrelevant, then what we learn, what our children learn, is violence is a way of dealing with conflict. I guess what we have to say is, maybe all you can do is, being aware of these results, begin to be more cautious, first of all, in not thinking us and them, the evil guys, the career criminals, the monsters, the Nazis, and say, from our research, is the best estimate you could make if you were a subject in any of these experiments, if you were a young person in Nazi Germany, if you were a kid in Brazil, is that you would do what the average does. Your best prediction is the base rate. Or you could say, I don't know. What you do not have the permission to say after this report is, I would be the good one. That is, you just can't say that, because to be the person who resists the kind of pressures here is what I call a hero. My notion of a hero is not somebody who throws themselves on a hand grenade. It's somebody, when given the pressures of these situations, in the Milgram study, in the prison study, in the studies of de-individuation, in a host of these other studies, as well as in real life, a person who can resist those pressures and simply say, no, I won't do it, or I refuse to go on, or I'm not going to participate in this. I'm going to go home. I'm not going to be one of the 500. To me, that's a definition of a hero. So again, I think maybe the notion is we all have to begin to say, because I know I could be at risk, be vulnerable for violence, for all of these other things, I have to be on guard, and in fact, the alternative for me is to be a hero. I have to be aware of how powerful these forces are and resist them, not think in us and them terms, and then I have to do everything I can not to allow anybody to become anonymous. Okay? So, a very simple thing. How do we deal with the homeless? Well, you give them some money, okay? Well, you can't if there's more and more. My concern is, when you give them the money, what do you say? If you don't say anything, you shouldn't give any money. What you say is, here, I'm really sorry, or, hope things get better. One sentence, you change that person's life to some extent. I mean, I know, I do it all the time now. And the person will start talking, because when they are a beggar, they are an outcast. That is, they stand there and there's like an object, and even when people give money, they just drop money in because they feel, whatever the reason, feel guilty and they go on. Your job is to stop and talk to them for a minute. And you turn out, each one has a story. This one's a Vietnam veteran. This one, just left an abusing husband, has been beating her for years, and she decided to leave, but she's got no money, she's got kids, and so that I think the message is that I'm trying to tie it back to the message in the study by Al Bandura, that is, you have to humanize potential victims. You have to not allow yourself or other people to put the labels on of enemy, of the homeless, of street kids, that these are people, that you could be one of them as well as you could be one of the agents of violence. And in any way you can to make the human connection rather than to... Now, that's not into public policy that you can then say, okay, let's have law 3587. Peggy. What? What's the phone number, or how do they do that? How do they get in touch? Under what? Under F. But it's Family Support Center. Okay. Sometimes you just don't know how to. I mean, I never can find something I look up because, you know, if you're looking up on the H for homeless, it's not there, and then you give up. Yes. I'm sorry. He had his hand raised. Right. Okay, that's a good, awful question. In one sense, you know, you can say the power. What is the demonstration of the power of that situation? Well, the terrible things that it made good boys do if they were guards behaving sadistically, or if they were prisoners, how they broke down. The other thing is to say, poor man, a college teacher, professor. I've done, you know, research for 30 years. I know about not getting involved. I know about being objective. I'm a researcher. I'm there to do a study. I'm there to get a publication. I'm supposed to be objective and staying out of this. And there I am, totally enmeshed in the situation because I allowed myself to be the prison superintendent. I had an office that said prison superintendent. There were rules that when parents came for visiting days, they first had to see the warden, who was an undergraduate, when they went in, the superintendent when they came out. People dealt with me as if I were the superintendent of a prison. And once I was, then it became my prison, not my experiment. And there are very different rules for how you maintain a prison from how you maintain an experiment. So, for example, halfway through the study, there was a rumor that there was going to be a prison break. One of the boys we had released early, we heard, one of the guards heard, already overheard some prisoner saying, he was going to get a bunch of friends and they were going to break into prison. Well, that's really interesting, right? As a social psychologist, you know, let's see what happens. Well, as a prison superintendent, my prison was now under siege. So what did I do? I went to the San Francisco, Palo Alto Police Department, spoke to the captain of the police. I said, I want to move my prisoners into your old jail. Great. We went there, we checked it out. We're just about to do it because I tell them, you know, there's danger here. And then the city manager said, you can't do it because of insurance thing. And I complained about lack of cooperation, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then I came down and said, okay, a new plan. We're going to take all the prisoners, put them up in a closet on the 4th floor, dismantle the whole prison. When the break-in comes, I'll say, look, you know, the study is over. We decided to quit early. When they leave, then we'll find some other way, you know, to make the prison more secure. So we spent a whole day tearing down the prison, doing all these crazy things. And, of course, it was a rumor. Never happened. Okay? And also, we didn't collect any data the whole day. So here's a really interesting part of the experiment, but it was not part of the experiment because it's part of the prison. And so we collected no data. I violated basic principles of research experimentation, of data collection, because my only concern was the security of my, in quote, prison. Okay. That's just one example. Another example is, as parents are leaving, mother and father come out, and their son was one of the most disturbed early on. After the visiting hour, he broke down and had to be released. But when I say released, we sent him to student health. And I should say that all of the terrible effects were really situation-bound. Because we picked kids who were normal and healthy, once they were physically out of that setting, then they bounced right back. And we were able to tell them, look, it has nothing to do with, nothing about you. It has to do with the situation. And also they could see, each of them could see the effect it had on everybody else. So it's not that you were weak and they were strong. Well, he broke down right after they left. Well, as they're walking out, the mother stops in and the father, And the mother, I said, how you doing? And so she said, I've never seen my son look so terrible. Problem. I now flip into my automatic superintendent prison authority mode, and I say, what seems to be your son's problem? Remember that from elementary school? I mean, when your parents come, what seems to be your son's problem? And she said, I don't know. He said he's not sleeping. I mean, he's got bags under his eyes. I mean, he's trembling. He said you wake them up all hours of the night. I said, oh, you mean the counts. The counts are administratively necessary for each guard shift to account for all the prisoners, to see that they line up and the numbers are read off, and then they're put to sleep. Yes, we're sorry we have to wake them up, but it's the only way we can do it efficiently. I go through the whole thing. I said, yeah, but he really looks terrible. I don't mean to make trouble. Bong. I don't mean to make trouble. It means she is going to make trouble. How am I going to deal with this? Automatically, I turn to the father, my guy, and I say to him, Dad, don't you think your son can handle it? What is he going to say? Well, of course he can. I mean, he's the captain of the basketball team. I mean, he's a scout. I mean, do it. I mean, I shake his hand. I say, I think he can. I think he's got the right stuff. He picks the wife up and says, come on, let's get out of here. We'll be back next week. You're doing really great work. She says, well, I don't want to make trouble. He said, come on, let's go. And he takes her out, okay? I mean, automatically, I have, the sexist part of me just flipped in and said, okay, I need an ally against this woman who is telling the truth. Her son does look terrible. She should make trouble. She should complain about the prison. But what I'm doing is saying, I'm a prison superintendent, and I have to protect my prison. It's not a situational problem. I'm saying it's a dispositional problem. Maybe your son has a sleep disorder, or there's some other problem. And then finally, nothing is working. I say, I need an ally in the father against the mother, and we hook up. And so the father is now willing to let his son stay in there and have a nervous breakdown that night because the father now is playing the macho role. And he wants to look strong to me. He doesn't want to say, yeah, my son looked terrible to me too, and maybe the situation is too much for him. So there are things like that. And the very last one I will leave you with is the reason we ended the study. I mean, why did we actually end the study? On Thursday night, had been Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I had all of my graduate assistants come in to interview all the prisoners and all the guards, like from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock. And one of the students, Christina Maslak, one of the graduate students, was in my office. And at 10 o'clock, prisoners were lined up, chained foot to foot, bags put over their head. They put their hand on each other's shoulder, and that's when they would go to the toilet. And the guards did this because the toilet was right around the corner, but they wanted to confuse them as to how big the setting was. And so they would march them all around the building. Okay? And since they were blindfolded, they didn't know where they were going. So I lined up, and the student is going over some tape recording she made. And I look up and I say, hey, Chris, look at that. And she turns and looks away. And I said, don't you see it? And really, I guess at some level, I was saying, don't you see my circus? Look what I've done. Look how they're lined up. Look at these little animals doing our bidding. And she turned and said, I think it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. The first voice in a week. Not the Catholic priest, not their parents, not friend, not secretary. We had a parole board meeting with secretaries from the department. Not one person, and there were more than 100 who came to look at the setting, who saw what she saw, said that. And what she did essentially is to break through the rhetoric of the prison, of the experiment, of the subjects, any of those technical terms that we use to distance ourselves from the reality of boys are suffering, I have the power, I am participating in this suffering, and I have the power to do something about it. Action was to get really angry. God damn women, I mean, you're all the same, you're blah, blah, blah. And, we walked out because we were going to leave at that, and I stepped out of the department, the building, and it was like the fresh air hit me, and I said, she's right. I mean, what am I, crazy? I mean, that it's terrible. I mean, boys with backs over their heads being chained and marched around just to go to the toilet. And at that moment, I said, we have to end the study, because I realized what it had done to me. And so that night, we called all the guards who were on other shifts. They come in the morning. We called all we had released to tell them to come in. We couldn't end the study because then it was midnight, in the middle of the night. We also had a public defender coming down to interview them. And so the next day, we then had all the guards come together for a debriefing, all the prisoners separately, and then brought them all together. Literally spent a day, I mean, given the intensity of the emotions that were there. Again, you realize almost all psychological research takes place in a 50-minute class hour. And this you say, well, the study ended 6 days. That's 6 days of 24 hours, day and night, living in this kind of nightmare. Okay. Is it time? I think this time. Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your time.